It might sound strange, but I find compressors absolutely fascinating. And the more I look into them, what they do, and how they work, they only become more complex. That's why I wanted to take some time to cover the concepts you should understand before compressing your mix. Starting off, let's cover visualizing attack and release times. Now you might be thinking, I already understand compression, I don't need to visualize it, but trust me for a second, this is helpful. So, say I have a snare playing every quarter note. Let's say our BPM is 120, so that means a snare hit occurs every 500 milliseconds. Let's say we set our compressor's attack time to 20 milliseconds. Now the attack time isn't instant. Once the snare's transient crosses the threshold, we have 20 milliseconds before the snare is fully compressed. So a little at 1 millisecond is compressed, more at 5 milliseconds, more at 10 milliseconds, and the most it'll compress occurs at 20 milliseconds and after, until the signal falls back below the threshold. The onset of attenuation almost always occurs in an exponential way. A little is compressed at first, and the compression quickly becomes more aggressive the more time goes by. After looking at various snare drums, I found the average length of the attack and decay, or the transient, to be about 60 milliseconds. So in this example, the majority of the snare's transient is being compressed. Additionally, right around the time when the attenuation becomes exponential and right after, we have the greatest amount of wave shaping. Since this region is comprised of high amplitude signals and the compressor is just now hitting its greatest amount of attenuation, the waveforms around this area will have the greatest amount of change applied to them. By shaping these waveforms aggressively, we cause audible harmonic distortion, which will amplify the transients, albeit not as much as they were just attenuated. Now, let's say from the point right when the snare crosses the threshold, it takes 200 milliseconds in total before the signal falls below the threshold. Also, let's say our release is set to 400 milliseconds. What would happen to the next snare hit? Well, remember, in our example, a snare hit is present every 500 milliseconds. Since it takes 200 milliseconds before the signal falls below the threshold, and our release only begins once the signal falls back below that threshold, then for 400 milliseconds, after that initial 200 milliseconds, compression is still occurring. This means that by the next snare hit, our compressor is still compressing. So the first snare hit had some of its initial transient let through, but the second snare hit will be attenuated in its totality, transient included. Now this becomes even more interesting when we consider the threshold. In our example, say it takes that 200 milliseconds before the signal falls below the threshold, but that's if our threshold is set at negative 10 dB. But if we set the threshold to negative 20 dB, it'll take longer before the signal falls back below it, causing the release to initiate later, meaning compression will occur for a longer period of time overall. Now, although using your ears is always best, keep the timing of your track in mind. If you know that the snare occurs every 500 milliseconds, like in our example, and you want to retain its transient, be sure to set a quicker release to avoid entangling other transients. Additionally, you could experiment with the attack time to find what sounds the best. A shorter time will result in more harmonic distortion due to wave shaping, which could sound good and even make the snare a little louder in some instances. A longer attack, around 50 milliseconds, will let just about the full transient through, while distorting a little of the transient's back end. Additionally, the lower the frequency, or the fundamental note of the snare, the greater the amount of distortion. Now, of course, there are more factors to consider, and these principles definitely apply to any instrument, not just snare drums, but this should give you some ideas to consider before compressing. Let's take a listen to a snare that's been compressed with attack and release times that significantly impact the transient, and then settings that let the transient through. Real quick, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, we have a mixing membership called the Sage Audio Membership, where you get access to Sage Audio University for in-depth mixing and mastering courses, private one-on-one mentorship, unlimited personalized mixing feedback, and 50 free mastered songs per year. Go to sageaudio.com or use the link in the description. Next, let's talk about combining compression with any effect. Compression is often considered a standalone effect, something to use when you need to control the dynamics of a dry or relatively dry signal. Then, Other effects could be built on top of that dynamically balanced signal. But think of compression as a dynamics controller for any effect that you use. For example, say I'm reverberating the vocal. If I place a compressor after the reverb, attenuate some peaks, and then amplify post-compression, those reflections are going to become a lot louder. Since I lowered the high amplitude signals and brought the level back up with amplification, all of the minuscule reflections that were being masked a moment ago are now loud enough to compete with high amplitude signals. This is especially helpful in a parallel context. So if my vocal is spectrally and dynamically balanced, I could send it to an aux track on which I've inserted a reverb. If I was to set the reverb to 100%, something that wouldn't be too common if I inserted the reverb directly on the vocal's channel strip, then any compression I introduce next will only affect the reverb's reflections, likely bringing up the quieter details to the front of the mix. The same goes for delay, chorusing, flanging, and just about any creative effect. If you run it in parallel, you could set it to 100% wet and follow it with compression to affect the dynamics just of the effect. Let's take a listen to reverb with and without compression. Notice how much control it gives us over the dynamics of the effect, and consider how you could use it to shape any and all effects that you introduce.
I'll never know what I've never known. Let it go, float on the ocean, coasting till the sun shows. I will, I won't.
Last up for this video, let's cover how compression and rhythm are inherently linked. So downward compression, with all of its complexities, is fundamentally an attenuator. Its primary function is to reduce the amplitude, ideally whenever you want it to. Now, the presence of sound, followed by the lack of sound, or a noticeable reduction in the sound's loudness, are the building blocks of rhythm. Rhythm is exactly this, but repeated until we notice a pattern. Because compressors periodically reduce the amplitude of a signal, this attenuation can, and often does, get interpreted as a distinct pattern. This pattern can augment or support the rhythms already present in a song via the instrumentation and composition, or it could interrupt them. Now, I tell you this to emphasize the importance of closely monitoring your compressors, especially how the attenuation that they cause affects the perceived rhythm of the track. This is especially true for bus compression, in which a compressor's attenuation affects all of the rhythms in a song. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to play a track that consists of all static signals. The instruments don't have any rhythm or pattern, they have constant notes and noise. Now, with compressors and ghost notes to trigger the compressors, I'll create various patterns and create the perception of rhythm by contrasting the signal with lower amplitudes or silence. Now, I'm going to start the track with all of the compressors disabled. I'll keep the volume low, but just a heads up, it sounds pretty awful. Then I'll enable the compressors. Still not great sounding by any standard, but you can definitely hear how the triggered attenuation caused by the compressors creates the perception of rhythm. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, we have a mixing membership called the Sage Audio Membership, where you get access to Sage Audio University for in-depth mixing and mastering courses, private one-on-one mentorship, unlimited personalized mixing feedback, and 50 free mastered songs per year. Go to sageaudio.com or use the link in the description.